On December 9, 1972, two paratroopers dropped into a desolate stretch of the Canadian North to investigate a faint radio signal. Battling a blinding snowstorm, they eventually came across a dark shape protruding from the ice. It was the wreckage of a missing Beechcraft 18. Inside, they found the pilot, Martin Hartwell, alive but incapacitated by two shattered angles. Scattered around the camp was evidence that Hartwell had survived 31 days in the Arctic winter by consuming the remains of his deceased passenger. The discovery made international headlines, but as the rescue team gathered details from the site, the focus shifted. While Hartwell was the one who was rescued, the only reason he had survived long enough to be found was because of the 14-year-old boy who had been his passenger. In the early 1970s, Cambridge Bay was a place of extreme isolation. With no roads connecting it to the rest of Canada, the 1,700 residents lived entirely cut off from modern infrastructure, relying on small charter planes for even the most basic medical emergencies. On November 8th, a flight was arranged for two high-risk patients, Nimani, a 25-year-old woman in premature labor, and 14-year-old David Kutuk, who was suffering from severe appendicitis. They were to be escorted to a hospital in Yellowknife by a nurse named Judy Hill. The pilot, Martin Hartwell, was under immense pressure to fly despite the weather. It was an icy afternoon, shrouded in fog, and with the polar night approaching, the flight would be conducted entirely in the dark. Hartwell accepted the mission, taking responsibility for the lives of his three passengers as they headed into the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Most flights use instrument flight rules, relying on cockpit gauges, but Hartwell relied on visual flight rules, meeting ground landmarks, impossible in a snowstorm. Compounding this, the local radio beacon failed. Without instruments or a signal, the plane veered hundreds of kilometers off course. Disoriented in the dark, Hartwell brought the plane down to 2,000 feet. He accidentally switched on the main cabin lights while reaching for a map, instantly blinding himself. Seconds later, the plane struck a hillside. The impact was catastrophic. Judy Hill died instantly. Nanami would pass away shortly after, along with her unborn child. Hartwell survived, but his ankles were completely shattered, leaving him pinned in the wreckage. Every institutional safeguard had failed. In the span of an hour, the responsibility for the group's survival had shifted from the pilot and the airline to the youngest and sickest person on board. David Kutuk was 14 years old and suffering from a ruptured appendix. He had never left his home island and had no training in wilderness survival. Yet, as the only person still able to move, he chose to take control of the crash site. Under the pilot's verbal direction, David dragged himself through the snow in temperatures that reached -40 degrees. He chopped wood, maintained a fire, and constructed a shelter using fir branches and a tarp from the wreckage. He also managed the camp's meager supplies. The plane's emergency kit contained only enough food to last 10 days, but David rationed the corned beef and soup packets to keep both himself and the pilot alive for weeks. By the third week, the teenager who had been a medevac patient was the one performing the heavy labor necessary to keep the adult pilot from freezing to death. While David worked on the ground, the most expensive search and rescue operation in Canadian history was underway. Hundreds of civilians and military personnel joined the hunt, utilizing a fleet of aircraft to scan the tundra. But because the plane's emergency beacon had malfunctioned, the search teams were looking in the wrong area. With only 6 hours of daylight and frequent blizzards, the window to find the survivors was closing rapidly. On November 27th, 19 days after the disappearance, the official search was called off. The government concluded that no one could have survived that long in those conditions. The official rescue apparatus had given up, leaving David as the only surviving infrastructure at the camp. By the 20th day, the rations were gone. In a final attempt to save the pilot, David set off on a 51-hour trek through the bush to find a lake for fishing, despite his internal illness and extreme weakness. He returned having found nothing. It was at this point that Hartwell made the decision to consume the remains of the nurse. David, however, reached a moral line he would not cross, and he refused to take part. On December 1st, David Kutuk died of starvation and exhaustion. He had burned through his body's final reserves to maintain the camp for a month. His death was the direct result of his efforts to sustain the pilot. Every fire he built and every calorie he spent was dedicated to keeping Hartwell alive until a rescuer could arrive. David's labor bought Hartwell the time he needed. 8 days after the boy's death, a private search flight spotted the signal fire David had taught the pilot to maintain. The subsequent inquest resulted in a total overhaul of Northern aviation. Gateway Aviation was held responsible for pressuring pilots, regional beacons were strengthened, and Hartwell's license was revoked. While Hartwell eventually returned to flying, David Kutuk received posthumous honors, including the Meritorious Service Cross, for his actions in the tundra. The structural changes saved future pilots, but the story of the crash is defined by David Kutuk. When the airline, the pilot, and the search teams failed, a 14-year-old boy became the only system that worked.